Good afternoon. This is Today on ENCA. Let's get straight to it because we have about half an hour because we have a special feature for you at the bottom of this hour. So without further ado, we start this hour with this. The South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, says it hopes the 31st of March analog switch-off deadline will be extended. The country is expected to move fully from analog television signals to digital. But numerous broadcasters say they are not ready. Even the SABC has admitted there's been slow progress in registering and installing set-top boxes. Well, is this deadline realistic then? Let's get some expert opinion. I'm joined now by Dimitri Martinis, former Digital Broadcasting Advisory Body member and Media Monitoring Africa's Director, William Bird. Good afternoon, gentlemen. So let me start with a broad one and start with you, Dimitri. The 31st of March is looming. The SABC says it hopes that the timetable can be extended because it's worried that a number of people could be left out in the cold in as far as access to free-to-air television and public broadcasting is concerned. Valid concerns? Is this deadline of the 31st of March for a complete switch off of all analog transmitters realistic?
Good afternoon to Lasizwe and to your audience. Indeed, this is a very, very tight deadline, not only as the SABC has recently indicated, but something that has been a concern for a number of months in the public domain, but certainly a number of years that people have said the deadline is unrealistic given the low number of households that have access to the adequate or the correct devices to allow them to switch to digital.
William, please weigh in on this. I mean, there was recently an op-ed appearing in Daily Maverick, which basically suggested that this switch-off deadline is overly hasty and will be a disaster in the prediction of those that wrote it. Your take?
Yeah, well, the organization I represent, Media Monitoring Africa, was one of the organizations that wrote that piece. And that's why, in fact, we decided to intervene in a court case against the minister with the ETV was going against the minister to ask them to please not go for the 31st of March as the analog switch-off date. The reality is that if government goes ahead with that, it will mean that millions of people, overwhelmingly poor people, will be without access to any television. So the Broadcast Research Council's figures say that 36% of our population rely exclusively on free-to-air. In other words, bunny-ear TVs or their technology so old that they don't have any digital means of accessing television in any other way other than through analog. So if government goes ahead with this, we know that they're trying to roll out set-top boxes. They're talking about getting 1.2 million done by the end of March. There's no way that they're going to meet that deadline. But even if they do meet the 1.2, there's still several million other households that are going to be switched off for years. Now, we know that today there was a story carried in one of I think it was Tech Central, talking about the fact that Centec has got a 3-year contract to roll this out. So Centec, by government's own numbers, they're looking at 3 years. So for 3 years, they're thinking, oh, well, the poor are just going to be without television for 3 years until they finish rolling out these set-top boxes. It's an unforgivable, immoral decision.
Yeah, in fact, as you talk about that tender that's out, William, I've had a glance at it. It was out on the 22nd of March, and the submission deadline was the 25th of March. This for a contract that will run for 3 years for the installation of set-top boxes that will enable those who don't have digitally ready devices and televisions to be able to receive the digital signal. Let me stick with you, William, and ask you, how did we get here? Why is this an emergency? This is a conversation that, as far as I can remember, has been going on for 10 years. So how is it suddenly a crunch and a major crisis?
Look, it's been going on for decades. You know, the minister was on one of the ENCA's channels just recently talking about the fact that there have been 13 ministers of communication previously, and that's one of the reasons why this is such a disaster. You then get a new minister, and she is, you know, credit to her, trying to say we need to get this done. We need to free up the spectrum. We need to get things done on an urgent basis. And I don't think anyone disputes that, and no one certainly disputes the need to switch to digital. What we are saying is that thanks to various delays, errors on government and various other things, we've not been able to make those to make that switch. We haven't been carrying forward campaigns on an ongoing and consistent basis. Set-top boxes haven't been installed over the last 3 years. Why is this tender coming out on the 22nd? Why wasn't it 3 years ago? You know, where was the minister? I can't remember which one it was 3 years ago. Why wasn't that minister saying, folks, if we're going to get this, let's do the 3-year tender now? Why are we doing it now? And what government seems to be completely unable and or unwilling to answer is this 31st of March switch-off date. They keep saying, well, the president announced it. Well, yes, all well and fine, but that doesn't mean that it's cast in stone, especially when it means that you will cut off the signal to the poorest of the poor from having access to any television.
And Dimitri, I'm also wondering because, you know, the conversation we are having now has to do with the deadline of the 31st of March, which affects, as far as I understand, 4 provinces because, you know, at least from the public record I've seen, 5 provinces have already made the switch and switched off the analog signal, if those figures are correct. What's been the experience then? Are we looking at a situation where a good chunk of South Africans find themselves unable to watch television at all unless they buy a digitally ready television in a rush, pretty much, because you know that's already been switched off? So what's the experience from the 5 that have already transitioned?
Indeed, Chilasizwe, the figures that the SABC quoted in their media release and the Broadcast Research Council has indicated that the audiences of the SABC have indeed plummeted in some cases by as much as 30%. In other words, there's been an immediate drop. And that's the indication, of course, that people who haven't already either migrated onto a digital terrestrial platform or the one of the other, whether it's a satellite, the pay satellite or the free-to-air satellite platforms, are without access to any of the SABC's signals. Indeed, ETV, as was stated earlier, is in a court case with the minister, and they have not switched off the transmitters, and so they've obviously retained their audiences, and so people still have access to free-to-air services provided by the ETV channel, and in the provinces where there are community TV broadcasters, those are still available until the 31st of March, as things stand.
That doesn't sound right, William, does it? I mean, if that is the picture, that there's a good chunk of South Africans who are out in the dark. I mean, you might think of television as a nice to have, but actually I would say, and I imagine that you probably will be couching it along those terms, that this speaks directly to constitutional rights of the South Africans, freedom of expression, access to information, and the sharing of ideas, etc. Am I on the right path, that this is how you are likely to couch this conversation and pinpoint where people have been left in the dark?
Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, it's precisely because you are cutting people off from access to a key form of information that indeed, when we, in our court papers, we do talk about it as a violation of people's rights to access to information. It's clear and unambiguous in that respect, you know, and government is the one that is denying that with no legitimate purpose. So all rights, as we know, can be limited in appropriate circumstances. And this is a circumstance where we believe that the right is being unfairly, irrationally limited, or it's being proposed that it's going to be limited in that fashion. So it's completely unacceptable that our government should be behaving in a way where it knowingly is acting in a manner that will violate the rights of millions of people, and those millions of people are the poor, the ones that desperately need access to this. So one of the comments the minister made recently was, well, you can buy a digital ready television set, but you're talking about upwards of 2.5 to 4.5, and upwards of their 1,000 rand for one device. And you're talking about a family whose income is minuscule. People living on social grants of 350 rand a month. That kind of figure is just pie in the sky. So it's just extraordinary that our government should be acting with such haste in a manner that will leave the most vulnerable and the most marginalized even further marginalized and even more vulnerable, because they won't have access to get other forms of information. They won't be able to see or watch the news or have access to their programming. For the SABC and other free-to-air broadcasters, it means their audiences are going to plummet. The community TV stations have been saying equally, their audiences are going to die. Any form of advertising that they're going to be relying on is going to disappear. So it really is a catastrophic situation.
Gentlemen, I've got to thank you for your time and your insights. We cannot exhaust this conversation as much as I would have loved to continue with it. We are completely out of time. There was former researcher, Digital Broadcasting Advisory Body member and Media Monitoring Africa Director William Bird. And of course, I must tell you that we invited the SABC to participate in the panel, but received no response from them, as well as Dimitri Martinis is there joining me for that conversation. Have a look at it. It's a fascinating conversation. Somehow we've managed once again as South Africa to precipitate a crisis. It is now a crisis that impacts, as you heard there, on the rights of common people, ordinary people, to some of these issues around access to television, for example.